Assalamu alaikum. Today I will discuss with you a very critical aspect of the methodology that I've been talking about in prior segments and that is really crucial to understand the Quran. So if you really want to understand the Quran, please stick with this segment all the way to the end and listen to it and try to understand it so that you really appreciate the difference between this methodology and prior methodologies for dealing with the Quran. Let's talk about the tafsir or the commentaries on the Quran or the books of interpreting the Quran. I had talked about them before and described them as following the wrong methodology, and we're going to detail it a little bit more today, and hopefully this will make sense. Basically, all the tafsir commentary books that have been written and that are available to us are based on the most important and the oldest we have access to is called Tafsir al-Tabari. Al-Tabari lived in the late 3rd century and died in 310 Hijrah. In other words, 300 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I want you to think about this. This is the oldest tafsir we have access to. He wrote a very voluminous tafsir or commentary on the Quran, interpretation of the Quran or explanation of the Quran. So the word tafsir refers to what's in English as exegesis. At-Tabari based all of his information on 3 sources. The first source is the opinion of certain people he considered qualified, such as Abdullah ibn Abbas and his 5 students. The second one At-Tabari based his information on is explanation based on the language of the Arabs, because they believe that the Quran is written in the language of the Arabs. The third source of information At-Tabari based his information on are the corrupted versions of the older scriptures, such as the Torah and the Gospel and other books. By using these 3 sources of information, At-Tabari was able to provide his own explanation or others' explanations on every verse in the Quran. The approach that At-Tabari and all the other interpreters since that time took is the same approach one would take when explaining or interpreting a poem or a collection of poems. So if you study literature in the Arabic literature or any other literature, you find that there are collections of all of the poems of this person or that person, and someone comes and writes an explanation of all of these poems. So we have Al-Mutanabbi is a famous Arab poet, and he has a collection called Diwan Al-Mutanabbi, and somebody comes and offers Sharh Diwan Al-Mutanabbi. This is in Arabic. Or you have, for example, in Urdu, you find Muhammad Iqbal, and you get all of his poems in one book, and somebody comes and offers an explanation or Sharh Diwan Muhammad Iqbal. Or even in English, Shakespeare, and somebody collects all of the poems and offers an explanation. So the interpreters of the Quran basically did the same thing. They approached the Quran as a collection of texts or poems, close to poems, that needed to be explained. And they were familiar with the concept by the 3rd century Hijri when At-Tabari was alive. And they offered explanations as if they're explaining poems and poetry. So their model for providing an interpretation and explanation of the Quran was based on providing an explanation and interpretation of poetry. And as we said before, the Quran is not like any other human product. It is not a human product. It is not of human origin. And therefore, they made the first mistake of interpreting the Quran or approaching the Quran as if it is a book of poems or a book of texts that needed to be explained. And I say it's a mistake with full confidence because, as we explained before in a prior segment called Unlike Any Book, we explained that the Quran is really not a book, it's an instrument. It's a communication instrument. So to approximate the idea a little bit, imagine that when you bought your latest and greatest cell phone, it came in a really nice fancy box, and you open the box and with it comes a manual. And you open that manual and you start interpreting that manual as if it's a poem or trying to interpret it like it's a poetry. Of course, that would be a little silly, right? And misguided. That manual is a user manual. It helps you understand how to use this fancy cell phone that you just bought, how you could put this instrument to the best use according to how its maker designed it. So the question now becomes, the Quran is not human, it is not a product by any human being. It is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and provided to us to have access to information direct from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, this book contains its own user manual, its own method. Now, the question is, where can we find the method or the methodology for making the best use of the Quran? Can we find it in any human product? Can we invent it? Can we ask this person or that person? Now remember, the Prophet ﷺ never gave an explanation of the Quran. All of the companions who were closest to the Prophet ﷺ never gave an explanation of the Quran. At-Tabari refers a lot to Abdullah ibn Abbas, who was a young companion of the Prophet ﷺ by the time the Prophet died. And therefore, we cannot rely on the words or the opinions of Abdullah ibn Abbas as if they came through from the Prophet ﷺ. They are educated guesses, they are useful information, but at the end of the day, they're his opinion. They're not based on the opinions of the learned Sahaba or companions of the Prophet ﷺ, from whom we never heard. We really don't have any references to these really closest companions of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, let's talk about the methodology or the approach of how to use the Quran as an instrument. When I took my PhD, I had to pass 2 tests, and they're very critical tests. Anybody who passes through the PhD process understands the importance of these 2 tests. For the first test, I had to appear in front of my examination committee. In that case, I had 7 professors, and they had 2 challenges for me. First challenge was to make sure that I was qualified in the field in which I was proposing to provide some new knowledge. The second challenge was to provide a clear methodology acceptable within my field of study by which I propose to reach the conclusion of my research. In other words, was the methodology I proposed to solve the problem I was proposing to solve, was that methodology organic? Was it acceptable? Was it intrinsic to that field of study? So their challenge to me was to prove that I was qualified, and number 2, that I was using the right methodology to solve the problem. The second examination, I also appeared in front of the same committee, and their single most important question during that second examination was, did I follow the methodology? I had to prove that I followed the methodology which I said I would follow exactly, and the results are presented and published, and accordingly I obtained my PhD, or I passed to obtain my PhD. This is really critical to understand what we're trying to do in this channel. The methodology we're trying to follow is very critical and determines whether or not the answers are reliable and credible and authoritative. So I talked about previous interpreters who used the model of interpreting or explaining poetry. We need a better model. The best model I could come up with is what's called the Rosetta Stone. Those of you who are familiar with the Rosetta Stone, or as it's known in Arabic, Hajar al-Rashid, because it's discovered in the late 1700s in the town in Egypt called Al-Rashid. That Rosetta Stone basically is a royal decree that was produced in the year approximately 200 BC. That royal decree is written on a large stone that includes 3 segments. The top 2 segments include the Pharaonic hieroglyphic language and the Demotic script, which is the middle, and the bottom part, which is the Old Greek. They basically said the same thing, but in 3 different languages or in 3 different scripts. And this helped the scientists in the 19th century to decipher and decode the hieroglyphic language. Without that stone, they would not have been able to understand any of the hieroglyphic writings all over in the monuments and the ancient digs in Egypt. And therefore, the Rosetta Stone provided the key to unlock a lot of the language that's written all over in ancient Egypt. The Quran contains a similar thing. The Quran contains the Quranic stories. As we explained in a prior segment, the Quranic stories provide the keys that would unlock the meanings of the words and the terms that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used in the Quran. The purpose for these stories, among other purposes, includes fixing the meanings of these words and terms. This concept, this idea, has never been articulated before. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed me to see this in the Quranic stories and therefore apply what I discovered from the stories to the rest of the Quran. Unfortunately, most scholars in our tradition never paid attention to the Quranic stories. Worse yet, they understood the Quranic stories based on the language of the Arabs, which is wrong, and based on the corrupted versions of prior scriptures, which is also wrong, because in both cases the Quran warned us against doing so. As a matter of fact, in one place in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, which is chapter number 26, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us directly, do not rely on the language of the poets. Do not rely on the ways of the poets. The verse says, وَالشُّعَرَاءُ يَتَّبِعُهُمْ الْغَاوُونَ. The poets are followed by those who mislead. In other words, the ways that you understand the poetry is going to be misleading if you apply it to the Quran. Very clear verse, very simple and beautiful and elegant methodological verse. And therefore the methodology is really key. It's very important to understand correctly how to engage and deal with the Quran. To emphasize the concept of methodology a little further, let me give you an example. If you are studying in the field of sociology, or if you are studying in the field of biochemistry, or if you're studying in the field of archaeology, three different fields of study, each of them has their own methodologies that are acceptable to them. So for example, in biochemistry, you may use microscopes, you may use cultures and samples and biological processes, and you may use the language that describe chemistry. All of these are part of your methodology. Those aspects and those tools and those means that you use in biochemistry are absolutely irrelevant to archaeology. In archaeology, you may use carbon dating, or you may use historical methods for digging, or for producing new knowledge, or for ascertaining certain truth. That methodology in archaeology has nothing to do with the methodology for biochemistry. And similarly, if you go to sociology, sociology is a field of study, it's a science in part of humanities, and its methodology has nothing to do with biochemistry. In sociology, you may use surveys, you may use cultural classifications, you may use ethnic characteristics, you may study collectives of humans, you may apply certain experiments to collections of primates. All of them are part of the methodologies used in sociology, and this has nothing to do with archaeology. Again, the methodology is very important in the field of study. So now the question, where do we get the methodology for the Quran? It turns out that the Quran provides us a clear methodology for using the Quran. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided us the instrument and provided us within it, the exact methodology for using it. One last issue that's really relevant to approaching the Quran and understanding it properly is what I refer to as the qualifications. Think of an airline pilot. An airline pilot, before actually taking control of operating an airliner, he has to go through extensive training. He has to have the right proper qualifications, such as physical qualifications, psychological qualifications, technical qualifications, communication and speech type of qualifications, etc. Now, if you go to a military pilot, these qualifications change, and sometimes they change dramatically. What's acceptable in that part of the world is not acceptable for regular civilian airliners. The key part is that the training and the qualifications are determined by the maker of that equipment or by the maker of that instrument. The qualifications for engaging the Quran and making the correct use of the Quran must come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as a matter of fact, in the Quran, these qualifications are spelled very clearly. Now, the flip side of this same coin is that if you have the wrong qualifications, or if you make light of the necessity of these qualifications, you may end up hurting yourself, or worse, hurting others. Even a professional chef has to have the proper training in order to use the tools and instruments in a professional kitchen. Otherwise, he may hurt himself and he may hurt others. The same thing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, if you do not have the right qualifications to deal with the Quran, you may end up hurting yourself, and worse, you may end up hurting others, and you become one of the misleaders. It is unfortunate, and it does not give me any pleasure to report to you that I found a lot of such examples. And I'm not judging anyone, I'm just letting you know that you need to be careful and to pay attention. If you truly want to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, according to the message in the Quran, you have to pay attention whether or not the people who are giving you the interpretations honored the qualifications that are spelled out in the Quran. For example, one of the qualifications is what we call the principle of relevance. The Quran talks about that none of the content of the Quran can be described as irrelevant or extraneous. And yet, in all of the interpretations, we find that the interpreters skim over parts of verses or determine explicitly that this term or this sentence is just repeating the prior sentence. And therefore, they deemed it extraneous. And therefore, they violated this critical principle, which is the principle of relevance. We've talked about this in prior segments. Another principle or another qualification that the Quran talks about is that the nouns and the words and the terms and the vocabulary must be defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You cannot assign a meaning or an indication to a term based on the language of the Arabs or based on the language of the poets. That would not work. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the term and provided the definition for it within the Quran. And therefore, before you assume you know the meaning of one word or one term, you have to look through the Quran and see if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used it within the context of a story to really clarify what that term means. And we've given examples of this in prior segments. Yes, this seems to be a lot of hard work. And yes, this makes the Quran harder to engage and to deal with. And yes, this work has never really properly been done before. And so be it. It has to be done. It is no surprise that we look around us and see the condition of all Muslims today being confused about the Quran. And this is a reality. And of course, what the Western colonialism has done in the last several hundred years did not help. But we cannot blame colonialism for this problem. This problem started 1200 years ago with the interpreters who misengaged or misunderstood the purpose of the Quran and therefore dealt with the Quran based on the wrong assumptions that they are dealing with a collection of poems or a collection of beautiful, eloquent texts written like a literature type of text, which the Quran includes beauty and eloquence and all of this stuff, no question about it. But that's not how you engage the Quran to try to understand it. You have to have the right methodology from within the Quran, and you have to have the right principles and the qualifications in yourself in order to really embody and encompass the seriousness of the task of dealing with the Quran. Now, I will leave you with one significant question. All of those preachers that we see today on YouTube or Instagram or various satellite channels preaching and talking about the Quran according to the words and the opinions of all of these old interpreters starting from 1200 years ago and coming forth and basically regurgitating exactly what they read in these books. Are they really leading you in the right direction? I leave the question up to you. Thank you for watching.